Step into the mist-shrouded history of ancient Ireland, a land where myth and reality intertwine. Long before the arrival of Christianity, this Emerald Isle was guided by a mysterious and powerful class of people, the Druids. But who were they, really, beyond the romantic images of robed figures in sacred groves? The historical truth of the Irish Druids is a puzzle we're still piecing together. They were the spiritual leaders, the lawmakers, the healers, and the keepers of immense knowledge. Yet, they left no written records of their own. Their wisdom was a sacred trust, passed down through generations only by word of mouth, committed to memory through long years of arduous training. The classical writers of Greece and Rome, like Julius Caesar, gave us our first written glimpses of the Druids. They described them as philosophers and theologians who presided over sacrifices and settled disputes. But these were outside perspectives, often colored by the politics of conquest. Caesar, for instance, portrayed them as a powerful, unifying force among the Gauls, a threat to Roman expansion. How much of this applies to their Irish counterpart? While Celtic cultures shared many similarities, Ireland was unique. It was never conquered by Rome, allowing its Druidic traditions to evolve and flourish in relative isolation for centuries longer than on the European mainland. This makes the Irish Druid a particularly fascinating and perhaps more authentic subject of study. In the old Irish sagas, which were finally written down by Christian monks centuries later, the Druids are depicted as formidable figures. They are advisors to kings, possessors of magical powers, capable of prophesying the future, conjuring storms, and casting potent spells. Take the legendary Cathbad, chief druid at the courts of King Conquer Mac Nessa. He was said to have prophesied the tragic destiny of Deirdre, of the sorrows at her birth. Or Mogruth, a powerful, even frightening druid who could fly in a magical machine and turn men to stone with his gaze. These tales, while epic, blur the lines between history and folklore. Were these magical feats simply a way for ancient storytellers to describe advanced knowledge of the natural world, astronomy, or even human psychology? It's a tantalizing question. The training to become a druid was said to be incredibly demanding, lasting up to 20 years. Novices had to memorize countless poems, laws, histories, and genealogies. This oral tradition was paramount. It ensured that knowledge was not just learned, but lived. It also kept their wisdom exclusive, a secret held within their order. Their schools, often located deep within forests or on remote islands, were centers of intellectual life. They studied the movements of the stars, the cycles of the moon, and the secrets of the natural world. They were astronomers, botanists, and doctors. Their understanding of medicinal herbs was likely profound, a practical magic that could heal the sick and wounded. The respect they commanded was immense. It was said that even kings could not speak before a druid did in their court. The core of druidic belief revolved around the natural world. They didn't worship gods in temples built by human hands. Their cathedrals were the ancient oak groves, their altars the weathered stones of the earth. The oak tree was especially sacred, a symbol of strength, wisdom, and endurance. The word druid itself is often thought to derive from the Celtic word for oak. They revered the spirits of rivers, mountains, and trees. This deep connection to nature suggests a belief system that saw the divine in all aspects of the living world. They also held strong beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. Classical sources tell us the Druids taught the doctrine of reincarnation or the transmigration of the soul, believing that the soul was immortal and passed from one body to another after death. This belief might explain the famed courage of Celtic warriors who fought without fear of a final end. So, what happened to them? The arrival of St. Patrick and Christianity in the 5th century marked the beginning of the end for the old Druidic order. But it wasn't a sudden, violent overthrow as is often imagined. The transition was gradual, a slow fading of the old ways. Many aspects of Druidism were absorbed and repurposed into the new faith. Some scholars argue that the intellectual tradition of the Druids was passed on to the Christian monks, who then preserved the ancient sagas and laws in their monasteries. The role of the Druid as royal advisor was replaced by the bishop, and their scholarly functions were taken over by a new class of literate clergy, the bards and poets, known as the Fili, who had always been a part of the Druidic class, continued their traditions for many centuries, preserving the stories and oral heritage of the people. In a way, the spirit of the Druids didn't completely vanish. It simply changed form. In recent centuries, there's been a powerful resurgence of interest in the Druids, starting in the 18th century with the Druid revival. Romantics and antiquarians sought to reconnect with this ancient heritage. This led to the formation of modern Druid orders, which, while not a direct continuation of the ancient priesthood, draw inspiration from their philosophies. Today, modern Druidry is a vibrant spiritual path for many around the world. It emphasizes a reverence for nature, personal growth, and creativity. It seeks to reconstruct and reinterpret the wisdom of the ancients for a modern context, focusing on peace, conservation, and a deep personal connection to the natural world. These new Druids study the same landscapes, celebrate the same solar festivals like Samhain and Beltane, and look to the old myths for guidance, keeping the spirit of their ancient predecessors alive. The mystery of the Irish Druids ultimately endures because they kept their most profound secrets to themselves. Their world was one of oral tradition, of knowledge whispered from master to apprentice under the boughs of an ancient oak. What we have left are echoes, second-hand accounts from their rivals, mythologized versions of them in epic tales, and the faint traces of their beliefs in the folklore and landscape of Ireland itself. They are a powerful reminder of a time when the worlds of spirit and nature were one, when wisdom was earned through a lifetime of dedication, and when the greatest truths were not written in books, but carried in the heart and spoken on the wind. The search for the true Druid is a journey into the very soul of ancient Ireland, a puzzle that continues to captivate and inspire us to this day. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration of history and mystery, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Let me know in the comments what ancient mystery you'd like me to cover next. See you soon. Have you ever heard of the Druids? Maybe you picture old, bearded men in white robes, gathering at Stonehenge for some ancient ritual. Or perhaps you think of magic, nature, and the misty forests of Celtic lore. The truth is, the Druids are one of history's most fascinating and mysterious groups, and their story is so much more than just legend. Today, we're diving deep into the world of the ancient Druids to uncover who they really were. So, Who were these people? The Druids were a high-ranking class in ancient Celtic societies, not just in Britain, but across much of Western Europe, like in Gaul, which is modern-day France. They weren't just priests, they were the intellectual elite. Imagine a society where your judges, your teachers, your philosophers, your scientists, and your spiritual leaders were all part of the same group. That was the Druids. They held immense power and respect. They could even step between two warring armies and command them to stop fighting. Talk about influence. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding the Druids is what they actually believed. Here's the tricky part. They didn't write anything down. Their entire body of knowledge, from laws and history to poetry and spiritual teachings, was memorized. This wasn't because they couldn't write. It was a deliberate choice. They believed that committing everything to memory made the knowledge more sacred and kept it exclusive. A druid in training might spend up to 20 years learning thousands of verses by heart. Can you imagine the dedication? Because they left no written records of their own. Everything we know about them comes from outside sources, mainly Roman writers like Julius Caesar. And let's be honest, Caesar wasn't exactly their biggest fan. He was trying to conquer their lands, so his accounts are often biased. He described them as overseeing human sacrifices, which created this dark, sensationalized image that has stuck around for centuries. While it's possible some form of ritual sacrifice occurred, many historians think Caesar exaggerated it to paint the Celts as barbaric and justify his invasion. It's like a bad Yelp review from a rival business owner. So, what did they teach? At the core of Druidic belief was the idea of the immortal soul. They believed that when a person died, their soul would move into another body. This wasn't just reincarnation, as we might think of it today. It was a firm belief that life didn't end with death, which made Celtic warriors famously fearless in battle. Why fear death if it's just a doorway to a new life? They also had a deep, profound connection to the natural world. For the Druids, nature wasn't just a resource. It was sacred. Certain trees, like the oak, were especially important. The very word druid is thought to come from the Celtic word for oak, daru. They saw the divine in the rustling leaves, the flowing rivers, and the changing seasons. Their ceremonies were often held in sacred groves of trees, not in man-made temples. Let's talk about their calendar. The Druids were expert astronomers. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and stars to create complex calendars. This wasn't just for farming. It was deeply tied to their spiritual life. Their major festivals were aligned with key astronomical events like the solstices and the equinoxes. You've probably heard of some of them. There was Samhain, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter's darkness. This is the festival that many believe evolved into modern Halloween. Then there was Beltane, a joyous celebration of spring and new life, often involving massive bonfires. These weren't just parties. They were moments to honor the cycles of nature and the cosmos. What happened to the ancient Druids? Well, their decline began with the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain. The Romans saw the Druids as a major threat to their authority. The Druids were the glue holding Celtic society together, a source of national identity and resistance. So, the Romans systematically targeted them. One of the most famous and brutal events was the Roman attack on the island of Anglesey in Wales, a major Druidic center. The Roman historian Tacitus described how Roman soldiers were initially terrified by the sight of black-robed priestesses and chanting Druids, but they ultimately destroyed the sacred groves and wiped out the leadership. As Christianity spread across Europe, the old ways were further suppressed. The knowledge that had been passed down orally for centuries began to fade away. By the Middle Ages, the classical Druids of antiquity were gone. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, during what's known as the Romantic period. There was a huge resurgence of interest in all things ancient and Celtic. People started looking back at the Druids, not as they were, but through a romanticized lens. This is where our modern image of the Druid really takes shape, the wise, mystical sage connected to Stonehenge. The problem, the ancient Druids likely had nothing to do with Stonehenge. Stonehenge was built thousands of years before the Celts and Druids even arrived in Britain. But this new Neo-Druid movement adopted it as a powerful symbol. These new Druids were scholars, poets, and artists who wanted to revive what they saw as Britain's native spiritual tradition. This revival has continued right up to the present day. Modern Druidry, or Neo-Druidry, is now a recognized spiritual path practiced by thousands of people all over the world. It's not an attempt to perfectly reconstruct the past, which is impossible without written records. Instead, it's inspired by the core principles of the ancient Druids. Modern Druids focus on creativity, wisdom, and a deep reverence for nature. They celebrate the seasons, plant trees, get involved in environmental causes, and seek personal growth. It's a living, evolving spirituality that draws on the inspiration of its ancient namesakes while adapting to the modern world. There are different orders and groups, each with their own unique flavor, but they all share that fundamental connection to the earth. So, from powerful intellectual elites of the Iron Age to romanticized figures of folklore, and finally to a modern spiritual movement, the story of the Druids is one of incredible transformation. They are a powerful reminder of a time when the spiritual, the natural, and the intellectual worlds were not separate, but deeply intertwined. The mystery that surrounds them is part of their appeal. It forces us to use our imagination, to piece together clues, and to wonder about the vast knowledge that was lost to time, but their legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of those who still look to the ancient groves for wisdom and find magic in the turning of the seasons. What do you find most fascinating about the Druids? The oral tradition, their connection to nature, or the modern revival? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history and mythology. See you next time! Picture this for a moment. You're standing at the edge of an ancient oak grove somewhere in Ireland. The air is damp and cool, carrying the smell of moss and earth and something older than memory itself. The trees around you are enormous, twisted, dark, impossibly tall, and somewhere deep in that grove, in the half-light of an early morning, a student is not reading, reciting, word for word, line for line, from memory alone. And they've been doing this every single day for the past 12 years. They still have 8 more to go. Now, what if I told you that everything they were memorizing, every law, every star chart, every medical formula, every ancient story, every philosophical idea their civilization had ever produced would one day vanish completely, not destroyed in a fire, not buried under rubble, just gone, carried in human minds alone. And when those minds went quiet, for the last time, the knowledge went with them. No books, no scrolls, no stone carvings, nothing. That's what we're talking about tonight. We're going to take a long, slow, careful walk through one of history's most haunting mysteries. We're going to explore who the Irish Druids truly were. Not the caricature version with pointy hats and cauldrons, but the real thing, the educated, sophisticated, intellectually extraordinary class of people who sat at the very center of Celtic civilization for centuries. We'll look at what the Romans saw when they encountered them. We'll read between the lines of ancient Irish manuscripts. We'll wander through archaeological sites that still hold their secrets in stone and bone and earth. And at the end of it all, we'll sit quietly with the weight of what was lost, because what was lost was staggering. So, settle in. Take a slow breath. Let your body get comfortable. And let's begin. To understand the Druids, you have to understand the world they lived in. We're talking about the Celtic world, a vast, interconnected collection of tribes and kingdoms that stretched, at its height, from modern-day Turkey in the east all the way to the Atlantic coastline of Ireland in the west. This wasn't a unified empire with a central government or a written constitution. It was more like a cultural family. Shared languages, shared artistic traditions, shared values, and, crucially, a shared intellectual class. That class was the Druids. The word itself is old, genuinely, bone-achingly old. Most scholars believe it comes from 2 ancient roots. The first is the Proto-Celtic word for oak grew. The second is a root meaning to know or to see with. Put them together and you get something like the one who knows the oak, or perhaps more poetically, the deep knower. The oak tree was sacred to Celtic peoples across Europe. It was long-lived, powerful, deeply rooted, and home to mistletoe. A plant the Druids considered almost magical in its properties. That the word Druid is connected to the oak is not a coincidence. It tells you something essential about who they were and what they valued. Now, when most people in Britain today hear the word Druid, they probably picture a ceremony at Stonehenge, white robes, a summer solstice sunrise, a bit of chanting. And look, there's nothing wrong with any of that. It's a lovely tradition that brings people joy, but it has very little to do with the historical Druids we're exploring tonight. The modern Druidic movement only dates back to the 1700s. It's a reimagining, a reconstruction, built from fragments and imagination in roughly equal measure. The people who gathered at Stonehenge 2,000 years ago were doing something we can barely begin to understand. The historical Druids are far more fascinating and far more mysterious than any modern revival. They were real. They were powerful, and they were extraordinarily educated. And almost everything they knew is now gone. Let's start with our clearest source, because clarity is something you appreciate when you're dealing with a topic this elusive. In 56 BC, Julius Caesar led his legions into the region the Romans called Gaul, the territory we now know as France and Belgium. Caesar was many things. He was a brilliant military commander, a calculating politician, and occasionally ruthless conqueror. But he was also a careful and literate observer. When he encountered the Druids among the Gaulish tribes, he took notes, and those notes survive. Caesar described the Druids as the most important class in Gaulish society. They weren't warriors. They were exempt from military service entirely. They didn't pay taxes. They existed outside the normal social hierarchy in a very particular way. Everyone else, kings, nobles, farmers, craftspeople, all of them operated within a structure of obligation and duty. The Druids stood slightly apart from all of that, and yet paradoxically, they held more genuine authority than almost anyone else. What struck Caesar most, though, was their education. He wrote that Druidic training lasted as long as 20 years. 20 years. In an era when most people's entire lives were spent working fields or herding animals from childhood onwards, this is an almost incomprehensible investment of time. 2 full decades dedicated entirely to learning. And every single thing they learned, every law, every story, every calculation, every medical formula, every religious teaching was committed entirely to memory. Now pause on that for a moment. Not because it's hard to believe, but because it's worth really sitting with. 20 years of intensive education, all of it oral. Nothing written down. The knowledge existed nowhere except inside the minds of the people who had been trained to carry it. Caesar asked the obvious question, why not write it down? He recorded the Druids' answer, and it's more sophisticated than you might expect. They gave 2 reasons. The first was theological and philosophical. They believed that knowledge, true, living knowledge, loses something essential when it's fixed in writing. A written word is frozen. It can be read by anyone, regardless of whether they're ready to understand it, regardless of whether they have the wisdom to use it properly. Spoken knowledge, on the other hand, is alive. It passes from person to person in relationship, in context, in trust. The teacher can see whether the student truly understands. The student can ask questions. The knowledge breathes and adapts. The second reason was more practical and perhaps even more interesting. Knowledge that exists only in human minds can be controlled. You can't steal it. You can't copy it without permission. You can't raid a library and walk off with centuries of accumulated wisdom. If you want the knowledge, you have to earn it, which means you have to spend years proving that you're worthy of it, that you'll use it responsibly, that you can be trusted with its power. The training itself was the security system. Caesar noted something else that deserves attention. He mentioned that some students traveled specifically to Britain, and by extension to Ireland, for their Druidic education. This is a significant detail. Gaul, despite being Celtic, was increasingly under Roman pressure. Britain had been barely touched. Ireland had never been touched at all. The westernmost edge of the Celtic whirl was becoming, if it wasn't already, the heart of Druidic learning, a place where the tradition could breathe freely, far from Roman interference. When Roman persecution of the Druids eventually intensified in Gaul, and it did intensify, because the Romans correctly identified the Druids as the intellectual backbone of Celtic resistance, Many fled west to Britain, to Ireland. The knowledge concentrated in the places where Rome couldn't reach. Which is why, when we're piecing together what the Druids actually knew, Ireland becomes our most important source. Caesar wasn't the only Roman to write about the Druids. Pliny the Elder, writing more than a century later in 77 AD, added his own observations. Pliny was a natural historian, obsessed with the physical world, with plants and animals and the properties of things. He noticed and appreciated the Druids' knowledge of the natural world. Ever wondered about those mysterious figures in white robes, wandering through ancient forests and performing secret rituals under the oak trees? Let's journey back in time to uncover the truth about the Druids, the intellectual and spiritual leaders of the ancient Celts. Forget the fantasy stereotypes for a moment. The real story is far more fascinating. The word Druid likely comes from Druid, meaning oak knower or seer of the oak, which tells you a lot about their deep connection to nature. Oaks were sacred, seen as a gateway to the other world. The Druids weren't just priests. They were the judges, teachers, healers, astronomers, and philosophers of their society. Imagine a single group of people holding all the knowledge of a civilization that was the Druids. They were the living libraries of the Celtic world. So, what did they believe? Their spirituality was woven into the fabric of the natural world. They saw divinity in every stream, stone, and tree. They believed in the immortality of the soul, thinking it passed from one body to another after death, a concept known as transmigration. This belief made them fearless in battle, as death was merely a doorway to a new life, not an end. Their calendar was a beautiful dance of sun and moon, marked by 4 major fire festivals: Samain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnas. These weren't just parties. They were crucial moments to honor the gods, ensure a good harvest, and mark the changing of the seasons. Samhain, which you might know as the ancestor of Halloween, was especially important. It was a time when the veil between our world and the spirit world was at its thinnest, allowing for communication with ancestors and spirits. Becoming a Druid was no small feat. It required up to 20 years of intense study. And here's the kicker: none of it was written down. The Druids believed that writing down their sacred knowledge would diminish its power and make the mind lazy. So, everything all, their laws, their history, their poetry, their complex medicinal formulas, was memorized. They passed down thousands of verses, songs, and stories orally from one generation to the next. This oral tradition was the heart of their culture, a living, breathing encyclopedia of Celtic wisdom. This also explains why we have so few direct accounts from the Druids themselves. They simply did unwrite them. Our main written sources actually come from their adversaries, the Romans. Julius Caesar, during his campaigns in Gaul, wrote extensively about the Druids. He was both impressed and wary of them. He described their immense authority, noting that they could even stop armies from fighting. He also mentioned their practice of human sacrifice, a claim that has stained the Druid image for centuries. While it's possible this did occur, especially during times of crisis, it's also likely that Caesar exaggerated these accounts for political propaganda, portraying the Celts as barbaric helped justify his conquest. It's a classic case of history being written by the victors. After the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain, the Druids were systematically suppressed. Their sacred groves were cut down, and their practices were outlawed. The Romans understood that to truly conquer a people, you must first break their spiritual and intellectual backbone. But the story doesn't end there. The spirit of the Druids found an unlikely refuge in a place the Romans never conquered, Ireland. As Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, something remarkable happened. Instead of a complete wipeout of the old ways, there was a unique blending of cultures. Irish monks, while dedicated to their new faith, also had a deep respect for their own history and traditions. They became the unlikely guardians of Druidic lore. These monks took on the monumental task of writing down the ancient oral tales that had been passed down for centuries. They transcribed the great Irish epics, like the Táin Bua Challenge and the Ulster Cycle, which are filled with characters, concepts, and details that echo the pre-Christian Druidic world. Of course, they recorded this through a Christian lens, sometimes recasting old gods as kings or saints, and framing ancient rituals within a new context. But without their painstaking work, a vast treasure trove of Celtic mythology and knowledge would have been lost to the mists of time forever. It's thanks to these scribes that we can piece together glimpses of the Druidic worldview, their laws known as the Brehon Laws Sand, their societal structure. The Brehon laws are particularly fascinating. They show a society that was remarkably sophisticated. These laws covered everything from beekeeping and property rights to a complex system of fines for offenses, emphasizing restoration and community balance rather than simple punishment. It was a legal system rooted in fairness and a deep understanding of human nature, a testament to the wisdom of the Druids who first formulated them. From the ancient forests of Gaul to the monastic cells of Ireland, the legacy of the Druids is a tale of wisdom, resilience, and cultural preservation. They were the heart and mind of the Celtic people, keepers of a sacred knowledge that connected humanity with the cosmos. Though their world has long since vanished, their spirit lives on in the myths, the landscapes, and the enduring fascination they hold for us today. They remind us of a time when the world was enchanted, and wisdom was found not in books, but in the rustling of oak leaves and the turning of the stars. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into history. See you next time. But remember, this is not the end of our journey. The mist in the sacred grove is only beginning to thicken, and the secrets of the ancient oak are yet to be fully revealed. The circle remains opened, and the true descent into the heart of the night awaits. Join me in the next chapter as we complete the ritual and find the ultimate stillness. The story continues in part 2. I will meet you there. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your night. May you find deep peace and restful sleep. Wishing you the sweetest dreams. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.